We're switching to English. We're very excited to have our two international speakers here today. One of them is San. She's going to talk about Pulimi. I'm pretty excited about this talk because I've used Terraform, I've used Terragrund CloudFormation, but I have no idea about Pulimi, so very excited about this one. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. So yeah, welcome, hola, to my talk about Pulimi, which might be just another CDK or something like Terraform with a twist. You will find out during my talk today. But before we dive into the topic, I'd like to introduce myself real quick. Hola, I'm Anne, soy Anne. I'm a cloud consultant at Superluminar, which is a small AWS consulting company in the north of Germany, in Hamburg. We're basically spread over Europe. We also have one colleague in Granada, actually. We're full remote. And yeah, before I became a cloud consultant, I studied e-commerce with a focus on computer science. And after that, I did my master's in medical informatics, where I focused mainly on data science and AI stuff. But I realized that data science and AI is not really what I want to do until I retire. I realized I want to do more back-endish and DevOpsy stuff. And yeah, then I was looking for a cool job in a cool company, and that's how I ended up at Superluminar. In my free time, I love making music. I'm basically playing keyboard all my life. I'm trying to start a band, which is not easy. Yeah, I also started a side business with my brother about e-invoicing last year, and I learned a lot of random things about XML and how you convert it to something you actually want to work with as a programmer. Can't recommend, but it's working pretty good. And yeah, last but not least, you might question, what is the German potato doing here at the Spanish Community Day? I'm living part-time in Madrid, so I'm spending a lot of time in Spain actually, and that's why I applied here, and I'm really happy that I got accepted and that I can talk here today. Okay, so let's start smooth. Who of you is already using infrastructure as code? So specifically, who of you is using Terraform or knows Terraform? Okay, that's a lot. Who's using CDK? Okay, a few. Is anyone using Pulimi already? Does anyone have? Oh, you can help me answer questions later. Great, I like that. So obviously my talk is going to be mainly about Pulimi, but I will also compare it to Terraform and CDK later, so you can connect the dots and see the differences or similarities. Okay, how did I actually start using Pulimi? So as you already know, I'm a cloud consultant, and in consultancy we often have the challenge that the clients come to us and says like, I want to do this and I want to do that, and we have to adapt to the needs and requests the client has. And my first customer was a greenfield e-commerce project, and they said like, oh, we want to use Pulimi. It's the new kid on the block. It's probably really cool. We think it's a great choice. No one had any knowledge, so we all started from scratch. And yeah, I'm basically telling you what I experienced within like a little more than a year in that project, and what I learned about Pulimi. Okay, before we dive into more practical details, I want to start with some general facts about Pulimi. First of all, the syntax. You can use mainly imperative syntax, so you can use almost any programming language of your choice. You could also use YAML, which probably is like Terraform in the end, so I don't know who does that, but you could do that. And yeah, but that's the first difference to Terraform, I guess. Regarding the state backend, it's pretty similar to Terraform. So you have a state that you have to maintain. For those of you using CDK, you might not know what the state is. The state is basically a JSON file where all the attributes are stored of your resources. So for example, you have for your bucket, the bucket name, and if public access is allowed, and encryption, and all the attributes. And you have to save that somewhere. And there are basically two options in Pulimi. Either you use the Pulimi cloud, which is a service managed backend then, so you pay for it, or you just do it yourself, which means you can have a local state, or you do it in your cloud. So in AWS, you can save the state in an S3 bucket, as you also do in Terraform. Regarding the providers, it's also pretty much similar to Terraform. So you can use the main cloud providers like AWS, GCP, Azure, but you have like a variety of other things. So you can do infrastructure as code for almost everything. So you have GitHub, GitLab, Slack, Okta, Kubernetes, yeah, you name it. So there's a lot out there where you can provision your infrastructure as code with Pulimi. Okay, let's take a look how the Pulimi projects are structured. So first of all, you need to have a state backend, which in our case now we assume is an S3 bucket. And in that bucket, you can have multiple projects, and each project can consist of multiple stacks. Stacks shouldn't be confused with CDK stacks. That's a whole different concept. Stacks in Pulumi usually refer to environments, but we will take a closer look to projects and stacks right now. So this is how a Pulumi project looks like. What a project actually represents depends on your application. So for example, in an e-commerce project, you might have a basket application or a search service or a product service, and each of those could be a project, but you have to decide that somehow. And in each project, you have an index file where your actual infrastructure is defined. So there are all your resources, your buckets, CloudFronts, ECS clusters, you name it. But yeah, of course, you can have multiple files and refer to them, but you have to have the index file. That's the entry point for your infrastructure code. Then there's also the general Pulumi config. There's some meta information about the project, so the project name, project description, and the URL of your state bucket, so the backend URL. And last but not least, you have stack configuration files. As I said, stacks usually refer to environments, so these are basically environment-specific configuration files. This is how a stack configuration file looks like. You have like the secrets provider and the key stored in there automatically. And then you can just put any configuration variables you want to use. So you can just put any API keys you might want to use. You can use any ARNs that you need in your code or whatever. So you can store everything you want there just as a YAML format. And what is really cool, in my opinion, is that you can also actually encrypt values. So you see here, the Datadog API key is a secure value, so that's encrypted with the KMS key. And Pulumi takes care of the encryption. So it's nothing you have to do. You just say, Pulumi, I want to store a secret value, and then it encrypts it for you and decrypts it when you want to read it. When you want to read one of those values, it's also fairly easy. You just initialize the Pulumi config. And then you require or get the value that you want to use, and then you can just use that value. So that's fairly easy, and you can have one configuration file per environment, so that helps you to achieve environment isolation, and it's pretty cool. Okay, next I want to look at all the providers in the AWS context that Pulumi provides. First of all, there's the AWS Classic provider, which is using Terraform under the hood, respectively the AWS SDK. And yeah, that basically means when Terraform has an issue, you have the same issue in Pulumi. But there's hope. There's also the AWS native provider, which is using the Cloud Control API under the hood. However, this one is only in public preview, which is not necessarily a problem. However, I encountered some issues. Like one time, I got a dependabot update, and I thought like, yeah, it's gonna be fine. And it renamed the database, and Pulumi was like, oh, you removed the database. And oh, I want to create a new one. Oh, I can't delete the old one. Oh, you have to delete it by hand, actually, and edit your state. And that was a whole mess. So I was like, I'm not gonna use that anymore because I was scared. But yeah, in theory it's like working, but it's still like kind of a beta thing. Next, there are templates. Pulumi templates are basically like example code that you can use and adapt. I didn't want to miss mentioning it here, but I don't have any experience. But it's just like certain use cases that you can just copy and use, and that help you get started with Pulumi actually. Last but not least, there are components. Components are basically a group of resources that you can use. For example, here you can see AWS static website. which probably gives you like a bucket and a CloudFront and all the permissions. And it gives you, in theory, meaningful default values and helps you defining all those resources with less boilerplate code, so you need less resources in your actual code. We used at the client the AWS X provider, which is for ECS clusters. So it was like less code, like you needed the Fargate service and the cluster, and the task definition was like included and stuff. So it seemed fine, and we thought like, oh, meaningful default values are something we know from CDK, and it's probably really cool. It's not always cool because, for example, in the ECS cluster, the desired count was always set to 1 by default. So if you use auto-scaling and you have a desired count, the desired count is taken. So if you have an auto-scaling group from 3 to 10, it still puts you 1 instance, and that's kind of crappy. So at some point, we decided to go back to the AWS Classic provider using Terraform under the hood, because that was the most reliable one. So that's also my recommendation. If you start with Pulimi, I would always try to use the AWS Classic provider using Terraform under the hood. Okay, now we saw some general information about Pulimi. Now you might ask, how do I actually get started? How can I start using Pulimi? So first of all, you need to start with the installation. You need to install Pulimi on your local computer. You need the language runtime that you want to use. In my case, it's usually Node. I like TypeScript. And of course, you need the AWS account access. And then you have that chicken egg problem like in Terraform. You need a bucket and a key that needs to be there before you actually start using Pulimi. But whenever you have that, you can actually log in to your Pulimi backend and start. Now, you can start creating a Pulimi project. Pulimi has some CLI commands for that. So for example, here we say Pulimi new AWS TypeScript project, and it just asks you for some information, like what's the name, the description of your project, what's the name of your first stack, and what's the region you mainly deploy to. And it puts these information in the configuration files we saw earlier and creates the project structure and so on. After running that new AWS TypeScript project, you get this index file where your resources are defined. So you get like an example code. And yeah, let's go through this a little bit. So first we have the imports of Pulimi and AWS. And then there's a bucket created. My bucket is the Pulimi ID, so this is not the name. And last but not least, they export the bucket name. And that's what you get, and that's your starting point to start with Pulimi. But you might wonder like how working with Pulimi actually looks like and how more complex things look like. So I brought an example that everyone knows of you probably. You want to create a role and add some permissions. So first of all, we have the imports again, obviously. The AWS provider here is the classic provider using Terraform under the hood. And then we create an assume role policy document. So that's basically the content of the assume role policy. Pulimi has that method here. You could also just use a JSON string. However, I prefer using this method because sometimes I forgot to put the effect or have like a typo somewhere, and this method helps you to have the right policy format. And after that, we create the actual role resource. So we say new IAM role. Role is a Pulimi identifier. Role is obviously not a good one because it should be unique and probably you have multiple roles. But for the sake of simplicity, I just put role here. And the name of the role is test role, and I already add the assume role policy. As you can see, there's a then and like taking the JSON from that assume role policy. That's basically because Pulimi wraps a lot of things in promises. And honestly, for me, it was hard to know when I actually have to unpack that value from the promise, because sometimes you can use the actual promise and sometimes not. And that never got like clear to me. It was always like trial and error. Maybe if I worked longer with it, I would have figured it out, but I don't know. For me, it was not easy to know. But it can get messy sometimes if you need to use multiple values. But in general, if you know how to use it, you get used to it. Okay, let's go on the right side. There's the policy document. So that's the actual policy we want to attach to that role. In this case, we just want to allow describing EC2 instances. We're using the get policy document function again, and then we create the actual policy resource. This one has the Pulimi identifier policy, which is not a good one again, and it has the name test policy and the description, and we just add the policy document we just created before that. And last but not least, we need to create a role policy attachment resource, which is basically connecting the role with the policy, and that's it. For those of you using Terraform, this looks probably pretty familiar just with the programming language around it. For those of you using CDK, you might know that there are some functions that help you not doing this, but we will get to that later. Cool, now you saw how Pulumi code looks like. Let's look at some Pulumi advanced concepts. The first concept I want to talk about are component resources. You kind of saw that earlier when I was talking about components. So basically you can create your own components or define your own components, so you can bundle multiple resources in a custom component. So for example, in my component, I could put an S3 bucket and a CloudFront and certain permissions and parameterize it, and then whenever I call new component and the S3 bucket and the CloudFront, the permission are created, so I can use reusable component or create reusable components with that I can reuse multiple times in my code. The next concept I want to talk about are dynamic providers. This is a little more abstract, but you will see in the example what I mean. So the use case for dynamic providers is creating some new custom resources, or if you have a cloud provider that is actually not supported by Pulumi, and you always have to implement at least the create method, but you can also implement the update, read, and delete method. So what does that mean? Maybe you want to create a random number with a certain library, and it has to be this library. And for that, you can use a you can use a dynamic provider. This one is called random provider, and whenever we create a resource that is using the random provider, it returns an ID which is generated by that crypto library that I want to use. Now I create a resource called random, which is using the random provider in the constructor. And whenever I call new random, the create method is called, and it uses the crypto library to create that random number. So this makes you super flexible to use Pulumi for almost every use case. As I said, you can also define what happens during a read or delete or an update. And yeah, I think it's cool to make you more flexible. The last concept I want to talk about are Pulumi crossguards. Pulumi crossguards set guardrails to enforce compliance for resources. So basically you can prohibit deploying public buckets, for example. There are two types. The first one are resource policies, and resource policies validate a particular resource before it gets deployed. So it actually prohibits you to deploy public buckets. And then there are stack policies that check all the resources in your stack, but after they got deployed. So after you did the deployment, it tells you, oh, this was not good, you deployed a public bucket. There are also like ready-made packs for AWS, actually, that gives you some compliance crossguards. And I think it's a cool concept. However, if you use it as a compliance team for your company, and you have like multiple teams that have multiple state backends in S3, you cannot enforce them to use it. You can provide the files and the policies, but you cannot check if they actually use it. If you want to do that, you have to use the Pulumi cloud and pay for it, because everyone is going through the same backend then. But yeah, I think it's still a pretty cool concept. All right, now the moment you waited for, you want to know what's the difference and similarities between Terraform and Pulumi and CDK. So let's start first with Pulumi versus Terraform. As I told you, with Pulumi you can use multiple programming languages, while Terraform is only possible with HCL. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the big example of Pulimi, and at least for me, because I'm more or less a programmer, so I like using programming languages instead of writing configuration files. So you have just if clauses and for loops natively, and you don't have to use some weird count construction that is like hard to read. That's definitely a plus for Pulimi for me. The next thing are the configuration files. As I showed you, Pulumi has these stack configurations, which are super easy to use. You just have that YAML file, define your values there per environment, and you can have even easily encrypted values, which is pretty cool. While in Terraform, you have to define your configuration somewhere and the value somewhere else, and encryption is even harder. So that's definitely a plus for Pulumi as well. Regarding the community or the ecosystem, Pulumi is growing. There are a lot of updates, and they're definitely enhancing Pulumi more and more. However, if you have issues, it's hard to find Stack Overflow threads or GitHub issues. At some point, you get to the point where like, okay, I'm using the classic provider, which is using Terraform under the hood. I just Google for my problem with Terraform behind it, and I find tons of responses, but nothing for Pulumi. But usually it helps using the Terraform workaround, just applying it to Pulumi, but you have to know it. So in this case, Terraform is clearly the better one because they have a mature ecosystem, they have a larger community, it's more established, and yeah, it's easier to find help for Terraform. Regarding the state management, as I said, they're pretty much the same, so you have to maintain the state somehow. However, I realized that Terraform is doing like a refresh, so whenever you apply something in Terraform, it's actually checking what is deployed. It's not just using your state file. I don't know why Terraform actually has a state file when it's always checking the actual state in the cloud. But yeah, it's like checking, like, did someone click something in between, basically? And Pulumi doesn't do it, which is not always good because we had some issues that a Kafka update went wrong and the state had like the updated number, but in real life was not the updated number. And then when you went back to another branch with that failed update, Pulumi thought like, oh, now you do a rollback to another number. I can't do a rollback. Oh, I'm just going to delete that Kafka cluster. So yeah, it's like you can do a refresh in Pulumi, but you have to do it manually, so it's not built in like in Terraform. So that's the difference regarding the state. All right, now the comparison to CDK. As you can see, you can use programming languages in Pulumi and in CDK. However, CDK has these great additional functions creating implicit resources under the hood. What does that mean? In CDK, you can just say bucket grant read lambda, and it implicitly creates those permissions for the lambda to read from the bucket. It follows the least privilege principle and is like saving you a lot of boilerplate code. Basically, the complex example I showed you, you often don't need that in CDK. And that's definitely a plus for CDK that they have those functions. Regarding the cloud support, as I told you, Pulumi is pretty similar to Terraform. They have all those cloud providers. They have GitHub, GitLab, Datadog, which is pretty cool because you might have a lot of like dashboards or alarms in Datadog, and you can also define them with infrastructure as code and the same infrastructure as code tool as your cloud. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, CDK is more AWS focused. There are some community maintained libraries, but Pulumi is definitely bigger there if you like in terms of variety. Yeah, regarding the ecosystem, it's kind of similar, like the comparison to Terraform. CDK is more established. CDK is actually backed by AWS. And you find way more information and issues for CDK than for Pulumi. So yeah, that's a plus for CDK here. And last but not least, the state management. In CDK, you don't care about the state because CloudFormation is taking care. CloudFormation can actually do rollbacks, Pulumi can't. And yeah, it's sometimes a little slow, I guess, but on the other hand, you avoid a lot of issues and yeah, you don't have to take care that you delete the database by hand to fix a typo. So that's a plus for CDK, at least for me. All right. I'm basically at the end of my talk, but I want to leave you with the key thoughts from my side. How does working with Pulimi feel like? I like this GIF because it explains it really well. Like, at some point you get used to it, you get going, you're like, okay, now I know how Pulumi works. And then you have one of those weird issues that you realize Pulumi is not doing a refresh, and you're like, what? Like, why are you doing this, Pulumi? Like, and it happens again and again, at least for me. So, yeah, this is self-explanatory. Is it good for infrastructure as code beginners? I would say yes, I was pretty much a beginner. However, I wouldn't say it's more difficult or easier than other infrastructure as code tools. You just need to get used to it. And yeah. And probably the most important one, would I use it again? It depends. Well, I think if there's a multi-cloud project or there are like more tools like Datadog and so on, where I can actually make use of Pulumi or Terraform because they are pretty similar, I personally would use Pulumi because I like it more. I like the configuration files more. I like using programming languages instead of configuration files. However, if I have an AWS-only project, I would go for CDK. All my colleagues are CDK lovers. I was the Pulumi fangirl, but I'm becoming more and more a CDK lover now. And yeah, I think it definitely has advantages, also having a mature community where you can look for issues and problems. And yeah, for AWS-only projects, I would go for CDK. That's it from my side. Thank you for your attention. Before I forget it, if you want to, you can add me on LinkedIn. And Superlumina is also looking for colleagues. So if you're looking for a full remote job, just talk to me or just leave us a message. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have now.
Questions?
Hello. First, thank you very much for your presentation, Anne. My question is, let's imagine that I'm good, let's say, using CDK. I'm used to it, I have it in my company, and so on and so forth. What is the learning curve to move to Pulumi?
So for us, the hardest thing was that there's not many projects out there using Pulumi, and it's hard to find this is the way how you define a project because it's not always really clear. And there are not many best practices. And it's like you have to get used to it and learn on the way a lot. At least that was the case for us. And it's a steep learning curve, but it takes some time to get it to a level where you think okay, now I have a feeling that I know how to do things. I think it takes a couple of months to you can define infrastructure and stuff, but after 3 months you're okay, I'm gonna refactor that because it doesn't make sense this way. But yeah, it's a steep learning curve. It's pretty different to CDK though. I think it's easier to learn it if you come from Terraform because it's more similar.
First of all, thanks for the talk. I feel very identified in here. I'm a CDK lover, sorry. But unfortunately, I'm working right now with Azure, so need to go to something else. I think Pulumi is a great tool. But I found essentially what you said, it's the biggest issue. Did you recommend any kind of resources in terms of examples? What I miss more is examples, because the Pulumi documentation is great. Even you can do an import and also produce the code. But examples with specific resources, do you have any recommendations?
No, I'm sorry. I wish I could help, but no.
Hi, really cool content. Are you able to write tests? In CDK, for example, you can write tests about the code that you are building and check that resources and so on. Are you able to write tests about that?
I mean, you can write tests and see the Terraform plan, what's going to happen. I mean, obviously you can do integration tests, deploy something and see if it works, but it's not really. I think it's not natively supported.
Okay, so in CDK it's the same because you write the test and it's passing, but the state also doesn't work. But yeah, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Someone else? Well, thank you, Anne. Thank you very much.
Thank you.